Calaroga Shark Media.
October 31st, 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door, he was challenging more than papal financial practices. Within 3 years, he would make an accusation that would echo through Protestant Christianity for centuries. The Pope was not merely corrupt or misguided, but was actually the Antichrist prophesied in the Book of Revelation. This was not hyperbole or rhetorical excess. Luther genuinely believed that the papal office represented the man of sin described in St. Paul's letters, the false religious leader who would deceive Christians and persecute the faithful before Christ's second coming. For Luther and millions of Protestants who followed him, the Pope was not just wrong about theology, he was the embodiment of ultimate evil. Yet Luther was neither the first nor the last to identify papal authority with the biblical Antichrist. Throughout church history, reformers, mystics and revolutionaries have pointed to the papal throne as the seat of prophesied evil. From medieval monks to modern conspiracy theorists, critics have found in corrupt or tyrannical popes the fulfillment of apocalyptic prophecies about false messiahs and religious deception. The identification of the papacy with the Antichrist has persisted for over 1,000 years, adapting to changing historical circumstances while maintaining its essential claim that papal authority represents a satanic counterfeit of true Christian leadership. Today, we examine the dark history of papal demonization, when the successor of St. Peter became the successor of Satan in the minds of those who saw in papal power the ultimate corruption of Christian truth. This is White Smoke, Episode 42, The Antichrist Popes. The biblical foundation for identifying the papacy with the Antichrist rested primarily on 2 New Testament passages that described a future religious deceiver who would claim divine authority while leading Christians astray. 2 Thessalonians spoke of a man of sin who would exalt himself above God and sit in the temple claiming to be divine, while the Book of Revelation described a beast that would receive worship from all the earth and persecute the saints. Early Christian interpreters had applied these prophecies to Roman emperors who persecuted the church, but as the empire converted to Christianity and persecution ended, new applications became necessary. The papal office, with its claims to supreme spiritual authority and its involvement in temporal affairs, provided an obvious target for those seeking contemporary fulfillment of ancient prophecies. The first systematic identification of the papacy with the Antichrist emerged during the medieval reform movements of the 11th and 12th centuries, when monks and intellectuals began criticizing papal involvement in secular politics and the accumulation of wealth and power by church hierarchy. Joachim of Fiore, a 12th century Cistercian abbot, developed elaborate theories about the end times that identified the institutional church with the apocalyptic beast. His followers would apply his prophetic framework to specific popes, finding in papal actions confirmation of their belief that the end of the world was approaching through ecclesiastical corruption. The most dramatic medieval application of Antichrist prophecy to papal authority came from the spiritual Franciscans, radical followers of St. Francis, who believed that the institutional church had betrayed the gospel message of apostolic poverty. When Pope John XXII condemned their teachings and persecuted their leaders, they identified him as the Antichrist prophesied to appear before Christ's return. Peter John Olivi, the intellectual leader of the spiritual Franciscans, developed detailed arguments that the papal office represented the mystical Antichrist described in Revelation. According to Olivi, the Pope's claims to supreme spiritual authority fulfilled biblical prophecies about a religious leader who would deceive many while persecuting true believers. The identification of John XXII with the Antichrist was not merely theological speculation, but had practical consequences for Franciscan resistance to papal authority. If the Pope was indeed the prophesied enemy of Christ, then obedience to papal commands became not merely unnecessary, but positively sinful. The execution of spiritual Franciscan leaders by papal authorities provided martyrs whose suffering seemed to confirm prophetic expectations about Antichrist persecution of the faithful. The Pope who killed those who identified him as Antichrist appeared to be fulfilling the very prophecies that his victims had proclaimed. The Great Western Schism of the 14th and 15th centuries provided new ammunition for those who identified papal authority with Antichrist prophecy. The spectacle of multiple men simultaneously claiming papal authority while excommunicating each other seemed to confirm that the papal office had become a source of deception rather than truth. Reformers during the Schism period argued that the multiplication of papal claimants proved the satanic character of papal authority itself. If genuine papal authority derived from Christ, it could not be divided among competing claimants. The fact that multiple popes could exist simultaneously demonstrated that all papal claims were false and demonic. The Council of Constance's deposition of 3 competing papal claimants was interpreted by some observers as divine judgment against the Antichrist papacy. The humiliation of papal authority through conciliar action seemed to fulfill prophecies about the eventual defeat of the man of sin through divine intervention. Yet the restoration of papal unity under Martin V disappointed those who had expected the schism to herald the end of papal authority entirely. The resilience of the papal office in the face of apparent divine judgment led some critics to conclude that papal power was even more satanic and dangerous than they had previously believed. The Protestant Reformation transformed anti-papal Antichrist theory from a minority position held by radical reformers into a mainstream Protestant doctrine accepted by major churches throughout Northern Europe. Luther's identification of the Pope as Antichrist became orthodox Protestant teaching that would persist for centuries. Luther's mature position on papal authority was uncompromising in its identification of the papacy with ultimate evil. In his treatise, Against the Roman Papacy, an Institution of the Devil, Luther argued that the papal office was not merely corrupt, but was actually created by Satan to destroy true Christianity from within the Church itself. The systematic development of Protestant Antichrist theory by theologians like John Calvin and Heinrich Bullinger provided detailed biblical exegesis supporting the identification of papal authority with prophesied evil. These scholars argued that papal claims to supremacy over temporal rulers fulfilled prophecies about a religious leader who would exalt himself above earthly authorities. The English Reformation added nationalistic elements to Protestant Antichrist theory, as English theologians identified papal authority with foreign domination as well as religious deception. The Pope became both the spiritual Antichrist and the political enemy of English independence, making opposition to papal authority simultaneously religious and patriotic duty. The Westminster Confession of Faith, adopted by Presbyterian churches in 1646, formally declared that the Pope of Rome is that Antichrist, that man of sin and son of perdition, that exalteth himself in the church against Christ and all that is called God. This confession made anti-papal Antichrist theory a requirement for Presbyterian ordination. The persistence of Protestant Antichrist theory created permanent hostility between Protestant and Catholic communities that influenced European politics for centuries. Wars between Protestant and Catholic powers could be understood as cosmic conflicts between Christ and Antichrist rather than merely political disputes over territory or dynasty. The identification of specific popes with the Antichrist intensified during periods of Catholic counter-Reformation activity, when papal policies seemed to confirm Protestant expectations about Antichrist persecution of true believers. The Roman Inquisition and the Index of Prohibited Books provided evidence that the papacy was indeed systematically attacking authentic Christianity. Pope Pius V's excommunication of Queen Elizabeth I in 1570 was interpreted by English Protestants as confirmation that the papal Antichrist was attempting to destroy Protestant Christianity through political manipulation. The papal bull that deposed Elizabeth seemed to fulfill prophecies about Antichrist attempts to control earthly rulers. The gunpowder plot of 1605, in which Catholic conspirators attempted to blow up the English Parliament, was seen by English Protestants as typical Antichrist strategy, using violence and deception to destroy legitimate government and impose papal tyranny. The discovery of the plot seemed to confirm that papal authority operated through satanic methods. American Protestant colonists brought anti-papal Antichrist theory to the New World, where it influenced both religious development and political culture. The absence of established Catholic populations in most American colonies allowed Protestant Antichrist theory to develop without significant Catholic opposition or modification. The French Revolution's attack on the Catholic Church was interpreted by some Protestant observers as divine judgment against the Antichrist papacy. The imprisonment of Pope Pius VI and the systematic destruction of church property seemed to fulfill prophecies about divine punishment of the man of sin. Yet Napoleon's concordat with the Catholic Church and the restoration of papal authority disappointed those who had expected the revolution to destroy the papacy permanently. The resilience of papal institutions in the face of revolutionary attack led some Protestant theorists to conclude that the papal Antichrist possessed supernatural power that could only be defeated through direct divine intervention. The 19th century saw the development of new forms of anti-papal Antichrist theory that incorporated contemporary political and social developments. The papal condemnation of liberal political principles in the Syllabus of Errors was interpreted as evidence that the Antichrist papacy opposed human progress and democratic government. The declaration of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1870 provided new evidence for Protestant Antichrist theorists, who argued that papal claims to doctrinal infallibility fulfilled prophecies about a religious leader who would claim divine prerogatives. The Pope who declared himself incapable of error seemed to fulfill biblical descriptions of the man of sin who exalts himself above God. Modern conspiracy theories about papal involvement in global governance represent contemporary versions of traditional Antichrist theory adapted to current political anxieties. The Vatican's diplomatic relations with world governments and its involvement in international affairs are interpreted by some observers as evidence of continuing Antichrist attempts to control world politics. The election of Pope Francis, with his emphasis on social justice and environmental concerns, has generated new forms of conservative Protestant criticism that identify his agenda with apocalyptic deception. Some fundamentalist interpreters argue that Francis represents a false prophet who will prepare the way for the final Antichrist through seemingly benevolent policies that actually advance satanic objectives. The persistence of anti-papal Antichrist theory across 5 centuries of religious and political change demonstrates the enduring power of apocalyptic thinking to provide frameworks for understanding contemporary conflicts. Each generation of critics has found in papal authority confirmation of their expectations about prophesied evil and divine judgment. Yet the identification of the papacy with the Antichrist has also revealed the limitations of apocalyptic interpretation when applied to historical institutions. Predictions about papal destruction and divine judgment have repeatedly failed to materialize, while the papal office has survived and adapted to changing circumstances in ways that contradict prophetic expectations. The theological problem with identifying any historical institution with the biblical Antichrist lies in the gap between prophetic symbolism and historical reality. Apocalyptic literature employs mythological language to describe cosmic conflicts between good and evil that transcend particular political or religious arrangements. The reduction of biblical prophecy to contemporary political criticism risks both trivializing the theological meaning of apocalyptic texts and demonizing human institutions that, however flawed, remain fundamentally human rather than supernatural in character. The history of anti-papal Antichrist theory serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of applying biblical prophecy to contemporary politics without sufficient recognition of the symbolic and theological character of apocalyptic literature. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration, but still written and produced by real podcasters, Mark Francis and John McDermott.